Hello everyone, Professor William Watkin here, and welcome to the second chapter in my ongoing investigation of anti-social media. This set of films will be talking about Trolls, Episode 1, Mauled by Trolls. Did I ever tell you the story of how trolls shamed me out of my career as a journalist? At the beginning of 2017, I became something of a guru on fake news, and at the same time I was trying to establish my credentials as the tech philosopher guy because, well, I am that guy. One day I decided to put the two together and write a piece on fact-checking. Facebook were in all sorts of trouble back then. When are they ever out of trouble? Because they sort of corrupted the American election by allowing themselves to be trolled by Russian hackers, the alt-right and click farmers. Now it seems odd to say this now, just a couple of years older and very much wiser, but at the time as a culture we were learning for the first time that the web is a pretty nasty place. And if your business is social media, you have to work hard every day to make sure your platform is not overrun with Russians, money launderers, hackers, trolls, desperate celebs, hate crimers, and, oh yes, more Russians. Facebook obviously didn't work hard enough, and when they finally woke up and smelt the flat white, they decided to apply a particularly Silicon Valley way to fix the small problem of their resident trolls. First, they wrote an algorithm that was scary and inadequate and ultimately hackable. Then they hired fact-checkers. Two fact-checkers initially. Now, one was quite reputable, the Associated Press, and the other more, shall we say, colourful, Snopes.com. Snopes were best known back then for clickbait stories about Bigfoot and alien abductions, which they then kind of debunked. They began as an urban myths website back in the day. Here in the UK at least, they were not known as reputable journalists. Why had Facebook chosen them over more mainstream organisations? For example, our own BBC had just set up their fact-checking service, as had Wikipedia. Curious, I did a bit of digging and I found what I thought might be a speck of dirt. It transpires that the professional credibility and indeed political neutrality of the site had been repeatedly questioned, in particular via outright sources and our own reliably hateful Daily Mail. I didn't attach much credence to any of these sources. But then there was this particular piece by a journalist I respected working for Forbes magazine. When I read the Forbes piece, I was excited. Snopes was all over the news at the time, and what this journalist and academic had unearthed about the website was definitely news. The piece revealed that when pushed, Snopes' founder, David Mikkelson, would not publish the criteria they used to select their fact-checkers, or whether they used any particular screening process. When asked the rather geeky question as to whether Snopes uses standard intra and inter-reliability assessments, their owner Mikkelson would only say fact-checkers work collaboratively. OK, then at least we can see who makes up this team of collaborators so that we can fact-check them? Wrong. The team of checkers was on any one piece remained anonymous. Put simply, according to the Forbes piece anyway, a site committed to transparency and journalistic excellence turns out to be wreathed in a secrecy that slightly calls into question its credentials. It was not, I make clear, that Snopes was a bad fact-checker, rather that as one of the main fact-checkers for Facebook in their fight against the trolling of Western democracy, they needed to be beyond question, squeaky clean, impossible to undermine, and in short, they were not quite there. That's not a bad little story. Who checks the fact-checkers? That sort of thing. Now, naive as I was, I didn't ask why the story wasn't therefore all over the news. This was, after all, just a hobby for me. Instead, I put together a neat piece and I sold it to The Week. I posted it just before Easter 2017 and it was published straight away. It was, I think, a relatively innocuous think piece with just a short paragraph using the Forbes work, but that didn't stop Snopes coming after me. Chillingly, I started to get trolled by Snopes even before, as far as I could tell, the piece was actually published. The gist of their attack, which lit up my Twitter feed for the first, and I have to say last time, was that my source was fake news, and so I was guilty of the failure to fact check. I found the tone of the comments somewhat derisory, mocking, world-weary, but not particularly nasty. It was of the order of overhearing colleagues, after all we were all journalists, discussing your lack of professional credentials behind your back, except that each time they dropped my Twitter handle so that I couldn't help but hear their comments. There was a group of Snopes people chatting about me in this way, as if I was a bit of an idiot, and broadcasting this thought to their considerable number of followers. I must admit it shook me. I'm a professor and I'm not used to being spoken about like that. Where did I go wrong? Did I deserve their withering put-downs? Perhaps I did. Doubt in my abilities started to creep in. It turns out, you see, that while Forbes is a legitimate news site and the piece in question was written by a legitimate journalist and academic, the piece in question was published as part of a blog written for Forbes, not an article published by Forbes. Now, these blogs are approved by Forbes. It's not anyone who gets to write one, but they're not fact-checked by them, and the pieces are not subject to editorial attention. Fair comment, Snopes, which I raised with my Forbes blogger at the time. His response was surprisingly hostile and, well, I have to say, troll-like, suggesting that I'd failed in what he called Journalism 101 by not allowing Snopes to see my piece for comment before it was published. He was not pleased that his name was used in my piece, perhaps because he didn't want to be seen as guilty by association, or maybe he'd had trouble of this kind with Snopes already. Again, I was somewhat shaken by being taken down a peg or two for the second time. Was the Forbes guy also right? Now, as I said, I'm not a trained journalist, but I am very conscientious as an academic when it comes to factual accuracy. So I raised this issue with my editor. He said he was fine with the piece and that you don't offer right to response in op-ed pieces in any case. He had no problem with the Forbes blog as my source and stood by my work. In that he was editor of Britain's best-selling news magazine, in the end his credentials trumped everyone else's, and I felt slightly vindicated. All the same, the aggressive responses of Snopes and the Forbes blogger had upset me, and I wondered if the tiny recompense for the piece was worth being mauled by trolls. More pertinently, I remember exactly the moment my Twitter feed began to respond to the Snopes people. I was walking my dog before heading out for an Easter break with my family. It was a beautiful afternoon in the countryside, yet my happiness and well-being was immediately poisoned by an emotion that seemed to rear up at me from a deep, dark, almost childhood place. That emotion was, very tangibly, that of shame. Now, Snopes didn't go in hard, and from their perspective, they were just following their fact-checking procedures. But the overall effect it had on me was really far from pleasant. So in the end, I pulled the piece and gave up journalism after that. It just wasn't worth it. I'll never forget that feeling of panic, cold, clammy sweats, anger and vulnerability that took me from my happy place in the actual world populated by my family and friends and sunlight and birdsong to that dark place in the virtual world populated by accusation, anger, hatred and derision. It was then, I think, that I had my gonzo journalism moment about trolling, in particular what I think of as the two fuels of trolls. These are the self-righteousness of the troll and, very importantly, the shame of their victim. Thanks everyone for listening. If you enjoyed that content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And also, if you want more of the same, check out those little links at the bottom of the screen.